Before we jump into painting with values, we need to talk about values in general and how we use values in painting. And there's few subjects to cover here. We're going to talk about value structure. We'll use value contrast to bring focal point. We'll talk about bright objects against dark background, dark objects against bright background, aerial perspective, and grouping values. Okay, let's talk about value structure and look at this painting. Value structure and actually grouping values will be something that we can connect to each other. There's few subjects that we've mentioned in the beginning that we'll be covering here. All of them are sort of intertwined because all of them matter a lot. But when you look at this painting, when you disable all the colors and make it basically black and white, you can still understand what's going on. Some of the things will be a little harder to read and understand, but basically you can get the idea. Okay, we have our Napoleon, we have also the Sphinx itself, and we can understand what's the story of this image, and we see those armies in the background. We see a little bit of that mountains in the background here, and we can understand what's going on. And the reason why we can understand what's going on is because we do have something that is pretty understandable here. Is we have shapes that we understand, and we also have we also have shadows. So when you look at this image and look at this whole area, you can see that there is a shadow outline right here. And we have highlights, which is basically this outline right here. We're just examining our Sphinx right now. So I'm just gonna paint little lines so you can understand the form and shape. And this is basically what the structure of this image would be like. Trying to figure out what is exactly in this image by just looking on values. And you can clearly see that because of the light directionality. We've talked about light briefly and how light reacts on surfaces, and also how those values are basically used in this image. Few things that we need to talk about right here is the absence of lines. So basically when you paint with values, it's rarely going to happen that you're going to have that little outline that we used to use when we were drawing, right? Remember when you would draw and even construct things, you would create those lines basically everywhere and then do little whether it would be cross hatching or shading with lines. There's a couple of ways of bringing that shadow, but basically almost always we would have that outline everywhere. When you paint with values, you never have that. Everything is confined within the value structure. And the value structure for this image, when you look at the value range for this image, you can see that probably the brightest point are the pants of Napoleon. So let's draw that little dot right here, and the darkest spot would be the color of the horse. Especially the part that's in the shadow, which would be right here, or even that ambient occlusion that we see here. It's actually slightly brighter. The darkest point is slightly brighter than the horse shadow here, or the shadow of Napoleon on the horse itself. So we have a range of values, and then everything that you see here will be painted between this value here, which is very bright gray, and this value right here, which is very dark gray, almost black. One thing to remember, however, when you just imagine that there is no Napoleon in the scene anymore, let's remove this character, almost entire scene will be confined within much smaller value range. So you can see the difference here, and if you would ignore that ambient occlusion that is going on here, you could even argue that the value range is even smaller like this. So you can see how different this is. The range between here and the range between here, it's much smaller. And we can do like a little blending going on so we can understand how dramatically the light or the value of those is changing. And the reason we're talking about this is basically each of your painting that you're going to do will have its own value structure. You can take this apart, and if you would just create little blocks like this, little squares, you would pretty much say, okay, this is my lightest color. Let's put maybe one more box, and this is my darkest color or value. And then mostly in between, we would have sort of this value right here, and we could just sort of populate from the brightest, which would be like this, to slightly darker, to maybe even this dark. So this would be the majority of the image, and then those would be the most opposite values for the whole image. So this is how you basically would structure the value for your images, and you can pretty much take any image out there, do a grayscale, and find your majority of the values that are in the image, and then those two tipping points. Each image gonna be structured differently, obviously, because some of the images will have more gradual change, and some of the images will, this will take 99%, and this will be maybe 1.5% of each of those sides. But it's important to know that this every image has its own value structure. The value structure is obviously affecting the way you read the colors, because colors is basically a hue added on top of the value itself. So it's just adding a little color, but the value of this color, it basically remains the same all the time. And you can clearly see, for instance, in here on the under the chin, you can see how hues are affecting this area. And when you enable grayscale, you can barely see what's going on here. It's just gray color, a little discoloration. But when you disable hues, you can see, okay, we have a little bit of blue, we have a little bit of orange and whatnot. So that's pretty much about the value structure. All right, so now let's talk about dark against bright. So dark objects against bright objects. And again, we're still staying with the same painting. And this is a great example of that. So we're building our focal point with values by creating really dark object, which is here, Napoleon and the horse. And then the background for this painting is very light gray. There's almost zero contrast around here. So in these areas right here, there's almost zero contrast going on, whereas the horse itself against the background is very contrasty. You can see that there is a dark figure and the really black and really bright background. And we can actually do a little bit of exercise here and increase the contrast a couple of times. And when we wash out the background almost entirely into really bright values, you can see exactly where your eye is going to go first is here on the darkest figure on this really bright image. And then secondly, on the Sphinx, which we already discussed, would be our second focal point. Let's talk about aerial perspective. So in short, to make this definition pretty simple to understand, is aerial perspective will mean that we can define the distance of the objects that we see based off how fainter, less contrasty, and bluer they become. So I have two paintings right here. One is from Shishkin and the other one is from Lagorio. Both of those paintings represent and show exactly what those aerial perspectives could look like. So let's look at the Shishkin's painting right now. Obviously this is a reproduction, so the colors might not be exactly what are in the original painting, but you can see that with the distance, the contrast and saturation of the colors is becoming less and less obvious. You can see that the mountain ranges and those hills right here where you see the trees and everything, they don't expose too much contrast. They're slightly darker obviously right here where the trees are. The mountains themselves are slightly, less dark when you see. They are more washed out, and probably in the original painting they are slightly more bluer. But basically you can see that difference between, say, those two most contrasty values are not as dramatic as if you would look at just this area right here. This is obviously so much more contrast in the foreground than in the background. So reducing contrast and making those things that we see the further away basically are less contrasty, less saturated. They could be darker, they could be brighter, depending on what kind of lighting scenario you're going after. In this case, for instance, the trees are slightly darker, and even the mountains, they're not too bright, they're slightly darker too. When you look at this painting from Lagorio, however, you can see that with the distance, we're actually getting brighter and brighter, and eventually the mountain ranges just become washed out together with the clouds. Again, similar situation, we're not gaining any contrast, we're actually reducing contrast, reducing saturation and tinting towards blue color, and this is pretty obvious right here. When you look at those shadowy areas from the hills, you can see that the shadows themselves are much more tinted, whereas the hut itself and the shadow inside the hut is actually very dark, almost black. So that's basically how aerial perspective works. You use this to define larger distances. Aerial perspective obviously is not going to work that well in interiors, for instance, because interiors are not having enough haze or maybe atmospherics that would make a justification to do that. Basically, the idea that something becomes less contrasty and more washed out and bluer is because of the air itself and the amount of particles that are in the air that basically are tinting the color into more bluish tones. Similar, if you look at the skyline during the day in major cities, you'll see there's this brownish haze that is hanging around the city with the distance, and that's basically smog, right? That's a pollution that is giving you more of a brownish tint for a change. So that will be pretty much about aerial perspective. There is nothing much more to be said about it. It will help you to define distance, and again, these areas, those mountain ranges here, are way less contrasty. You can see that we have right here blue tint, whereas in this area, for instance, here in the foreground, there's much more contrast. Even on those rocks that specifically are not super contrasty, they're still having quite big change of value, like this very bright value versus this dark value. Whereas for the mountain ranges, there is almost no contrast at all. You have to almost guess what kind of details are hiding in there. Okay, and finally, let's talk about value grouping and how we can use it to our advantage. We're looking at Gérôme's painting again, one of my favorite artists, and this is a great example about grouping values and creating separations using values to create interesting results and giving yourself, a little bit of that composition in here, and supporting the composition with the values, and also making the image to be much easier to read when you do it correctly, versus if you would start grouping values in the wrong way, and that would possibly create more issues and decrease the readability of the image. So I've specifically for this, I made this image black and white. I used hue saturation layer to decrease saturation to 0, just to show you a couple of things, couple of examples how those values are grouped. So one big chunk that you can see right now is this whole wall that is, right here. If you squint your eyes and look at it closely, you can see that this whole wall is one big value group. There's not much contrast going on. Obviously, some of the areas are darker on the carpets or on those flags that are just hanging down, which are creating a little bit of contrast, but that's more of a balancing choice or more of a compositional choice than anything else. But generally, this whole wall stands out because right afterwards, so let's say this is a group number 1, right after this you have this whole ground that is pretty much has 0 contrast. There's small changes here and there, obviously light strips coming from the roof that's probably made of cloth, and we could assume that this is a group number 2. Another really visible group would be the crowd that is in the background. So you can see that this whole chunk right there in the back, and parts of it here in that corner, that could be considered a group number 3. Then this middle ground that is not that much different from this this whole chunk here of the wall could be called a group 4. The difference isn't huge. It's actually pretty similar. It's slightly tinted towards being a little less contrasty and slightly brighter. But what is happening, we have those figures specifically painted to be really bright. And the reason for this is because, again, we have that group number 4 that is pretty similar to group number 1. Now, this group of people that we see here that are putting the thumbs down because they want the gladiator to kill his opponent that is, being submitted. This whole group, and let's call it group number 5, is creating a separation between 1 and 4. And this is pretty significant to understand. Not only this whole group right here is supporting the idea of, rule of thirds and the motion of the wall and separation, but also it's actually bringing that separation between 1 and 4 that is really needed to be defined. And finally, one last group, which has quite a lot of contrast, but you could possibly outline it like this. It would be a group number 6. And this is basically the whole aftermath of the combat. So that would be a group number 6 here. Let's actually put the right number here. So this is group number 6, and this is the gladiator and his opponent being submitted, and the other guy who's lying there and pretty much dead. So those are very well defined separations that allow you to see, okay, I can clearly understand what are the elements of this image, what is in the foreground, what the ground looks like, what are the most important elements, where is the separation going on, and all of that. When you look at each of that group, you won't see much contrast apart from the gladiator itself, which has a lot of contrast coming from, his armor and armor pieces and sword and the shield and whatnot. Obviously, this is just to bring as much possible contrast as you can to get all of your eyes hitting this area right away when you load the image. So when we disable everything, you can see that the amount of contrast that we see on the gladiator is actually allowing us to look at this person this part of the image first before we start exploring everything else. But the way the values are grouped here and how clean and separate they are is allowing us to understand the construction of this whole image. It's allowing us to understand what's first and what's where. We can clearly see there is a wall. We can clearly see we have those characters here behind that wall, and there is a separation between 1 and 4. There is a number 3, which is the far background, which is really bright. We have that aerial perspective going on in there too, and obviously number 2, which is the ground, very solid, almost zero contrast, apart from those small elements that are more for detail rather than anything else. So I really love that painting because of that clear and clean separation. You can see that when we look at number 1, even though when we disable hue and saturation, there's a lot of hues that are here. You know, there we have a yellow, we have blue, we have reds, we have magentas, we have dark grays or almost a green sort of tint to it going on here. But when you disable all the colors, it's almost very uniform gray that goes all across, and it's a nice chunk of value, nice group that is not creating a chaos. Worst thing that can happen is imagine if number 1 here had different values everywhere. Let's say the carpet itself would be much brighter. Let's say this flag here would have much more contrast. Let's say that red color that we see here that is right now gray, this whole part of the wall. What if that was much brighter? You know what would happen? This would start fighting for attention, and you want to avoid that. You want to have your attention and simplicity of attention clear in your composition. In here, in Jerome's painting, the clear attention goes towards the gladiator, and it's supposed to stay that way. The most contrast is right here where the gladiator is. You don't want to have more contrast anywhere else. Obviously, there's a lot of contrast here where those figures are, but the amount of contrast you see on the gladiator will attract your eyes first, and then you look at those figures because you're supposed to find that connection between him and those figures here. And then everything else is supporting this whole idea with being just grouped perfectly. You can see those values are not standing out too much. They're very uniform, much like the ground is very uniform, but it's creating those separations that are really needed. The ground itself is separating the aftermath, the slavery of the gladiators, and you can see that the wall is becoming this almost symbolical separation between what's going on the ground and what's going on in the audience. So that's how I read this image, and basically that's why I love this image, because of the clarity of how things are constructed. And you can take most of paintings done by master painters, and you will see that a lot of those paintings have really nicely are really nicely done when it comes to grouping values, because grouping values will allow you to get that clarity that is really needed to have your eyes focus on the right place. Okay, so in this chapter, I want to discuss briefly another workflow, which is basically borrowing all the techniques that we've learned so far. There's specifically nothing